The plane hummed as passengers settled in, whispers mixing with the roar of engines. A sharply dressed woman in her late 30s, known for her ruthless success as a CEO, leaned back in her first-class seat, smirking at the man beside her. He was quiet, unshaven, dressed in plain clothes, his little boy clutching his arm. She laughed under her breath, whispering to the flight attendant, "First class isn't for men like him." But then, the seatbelt sign dinged, the plane jolted, and turbulence hit hard. In that instant, the silent single dad revealed a truth no one expected. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more videos like this. Let's begin. The first jolt came sharp and sudden, like the plane had struck a wall of invisible steel. Gasps filled the cabin, drinks spilled across white tablecloths, and the overhead bins rattled with the force. The CEO, Madison Clark, gripped her champagne glass tighter, her face twisting with annoyance rather than fear. Beside her, the man she had mocked earlier calmly slid his arm around his son, pulling the boy close. The child's knuckles went white as he clung to his father's jacket. But the man's voice was steady, even soothing. "Deep breaths, buddy. We're okay," he murmured, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had seen chaos before. Madison scoffed. "What do you know about turbulence?" she muttered, eyes locked on the shaking wings outside the window. The man turned, his gaze steady. His name was Daniel Hayes, a 38-year-old single father who rarely wasted words. His son, Luke, just 10, buried his face into his father's chest. Daniel didn't flinch. "I know enough," Daniel said simply. The plane lurched again, harder this time. A shriek ripped through the cabin as a cart tipped over, scattering silverware across the aisle. A wine bottle rolled toward Madison's feet. The overhead lights flickered. A woman across the aisle clutched her baby, tears streaking her face. The child wailed, tiny fists trembling in the air. Passengers panicked, pressing call buttons, voices rising in fear. Madison froze, paralyzed between anger and terror. Daniel stood. Against the violent shaking, he moved with uncanny balance, bracing himself with one hand against the seats. He reached the terrified mother, crouched, and adjusted the oxygen mask dangling loosely from above her. He placed it over her baby first, his hands calm and precise, then guided her trembling fingers to secure her own. "Always the child first," he said softly. "You're okay now." The mother's sobbing slowed, her eyes wide with gratitude. When Daniel sat back down, Madison couldn't keep her mouth shut. "You act like this is nothing. Who even are you?" she snapped, her fear bleeding into her voice. Daniel didn't answer right away. He checked his son's seatbelt, tugging it snug. Then he looked at Madison. "Someone who's been through worse skies than this." Her smirk faltered. The turbulence grew, drinks flying, flight attendants gripping seatbacks for balance. Yet Daniel stayed composed, every movement deliberate, controlled. The contrast was jarring. The powerful CEO trembling in silence, while the man she had laughed at carried himself like the storm was familiar. And when Madison finally whispered, "We're not going to crash, are we?" Her voice barely audible, Daniel glanced at her, not unkindly. "No," he said. "But if we do, you'll want someone like me here." The truth in his tone sent a chill through her spine. The cabin shook again, harder than before. Luggage thudded against the overhead bins, and a collective gasp filled the air as the plane seemed to dip suddenly before leveling out. Somewhere behind them, a man cursed under his breath. A flight attendant, her face pale, clutched the top of a seat and tried to calm passengers with a wavering voice. Madison Clark's heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't used to feeling powerless. As the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the country, she controlled boardrooms, contracts, entire careers with a flick of her pen. Yet here she was, gripping her armrest so tight her knuckles were white. Realizing money and power meant nothing when metal wings fought a storm. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes sat steady, his presence quiet but commanding. His son Luke peeked up at him, eyes wet with fear. Daniel leaned down, resting his forehead against his son's for a second. "Remember what I told you about storms, Luke?" The boy sniffled. They always pass?" "That's right. And we'll be here when it does." The words weren't just for Luke. They carried through the narrow cabin, reaching Madison despite herself. Something in Daniel's tone was more than comfort. It was conviction, born from experience. Madison swallowed, her pride battling her fear. Finally, she muttered, "How can you be so calm? We could be minutes from disaster." Daniel turned his eyes to her. They were sharp, clear, eyes that carried weight, history, battles she couldn't name. "I've been through worse," he said simply. The lights flickered, plunging the cabin into brief darkness before they snapped back on. A child screamed. A businessman fumbled for the call button, barking at the flight attendants to do something, though they themselves were strapped in now, fear flashing across their faces. And then, an alarm blared. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing severe turbulence. Our crew is trained, the aircraft is secure. Stay calm." But passengers weren't calm. Voices rose, panic spreading like fire. Madison's chest tightened. She hated losing control, hated being just another passenger at fate's mercy. Her hand shook as she reached for her champagne glass, only to find it empty, knocked over in the chaos. Daniel shifted. He unbuckled just enough to pull a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Its leather cover was worn, frayed at the edges. He flipped it open, revealing sketches and notes in a neat, precise hand. He handed it to Luke, who focused on the familiar pages, drawings of planes, diagrams, survival notes. "Read through it," Daniel said gently. "It'll help." Luke clutched it like a lifeline. Madison blinked. "What is that?" she asked, curiosity piercing through her fear. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. His voice was low, steady. "It's the book I kept during deployments. Notes I made when I was overseas, reminders to keep my head straight when things got rough." Madison stared. "Deployments? You were in the military?" He nodded. 4 tours, Army Ranger. Then I came home, started raising my boy. The skies don't scare me, not after what I've seen." His words struck her harder than the turbulence. She felt the sting of shame. Hours ago, or was it just minutes, she had laughed at him, written him off as nothing more than a scruffy single dad who didn't belong in first class. Yet here he was, a man forged in the kind of fires she couldn't begin to imagine, steadying everyone else while she crumbled. The plane jolted again, sending a tray crashing to the floor. A woman nearby whimpered, clutching her husband's arm. Daniel glanced at Madison, then back at his son. "Fear's natural," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "The trick is what you do with it. Do you let it own you, or do you own it?" Madison's breath caught. For the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing beyond the windows. The wings seemed to shudder. Madison dug her nails into her palm, forcing her mind to stay present. Finally, she whispered, I I was wrong about you. Daniel gave her a small, almost tired smile. You didn't know me. No, she admitted, her voice cracking. I judged you. I shouldn't have. And now? She trailed off, pressing her lips together as the plane rocked again. He didn't gloat, didn't seize on her admission. Instead, he offered something unexpected. Fear brings out the worst in people. But it can also bring out the truth. You're not the first to look at me and see less than I am. Madison turned toward him fully now, surprised at the raw honesty in his tone. Why not fight back? Why not prove them wrong? He looked down at Luke, who was tracing a drawing in the notebook with his finger. Because my son doesn't need a father who spends his life proving things to strangers. He needs a father who's steady, who's here, that's all. The simplicity of it cut through her like glass. Madison, who had built her empire on crushing competitors and proving her worth to doubters, suddenly felt small beside the quiet strength of a man who didn't need recognition to know his value. Then, another violent drop. Gasps echoed. Madison grabbed the armrest, panic clawing at her throat. She turned instinctively toward Daniel, her hand brushing his arm. He didn't pull away. He didn't mock her weakness. He simply said, "Look at me, not the storm." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else, the flashing lights, the rattling cabin, the shouts, faded into the background. His calm steadied her heartbeat. Minutes stretched like hours, but slowly, the turbulence eased. The plane leveled. The overhead bins stopped rattling. The air grew still. Passengers sagged in their seats, whispering prayers of relief. Madison let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned back to Daniel, her voice low, humbled. You saved her, baby. You calmed this whole section of the plane, and you steadied me. She paused. You didn't have to. Daniel shrugged, a faint smile tugging his lips. Kindness doesn't cost me anything. And sometimes it's the only thing that matters. Madison stared at him, her chest tightening with something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not shame, but respect. And maybe something else. The storm faded, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, some crying quietly into tissues, others clinging to loved ones. The flight attendants moved cautiously down the aisle, checking for injuries, gathering spilled cups and broken glasses, their faces still pale. Madison Clark sat rigid, her expensive silk blouse damp with sweat at the collar, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her seatbelt. For the first time in years, she wasn't the most commanding presence in the room. That role had been stolen, effortlessly, by the quiet single dad beside her. Daniel Hayes had returned to his seat, his arm around Luke. The boy had finally stopped trembling, now tracing lines in his father's notebook, like a child coloring inside invisible borders. Daniel's eyes weren't glued to the window or the blinking lights overhead. Instead, he scanned the faces around him, measuring fear, searching for those still in need. Madison found herself watching him closely. She wasn't used to noticing strangers, much less respecting them. But Daniel had shattered every assumption she'd made. When the captain's voice returned, there was relief, but also tension. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've cleared the worst of the turbulence, but we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Denver to ensure everything is secure. Please remain calm and seated until we are safely on the ground. The cabin erupted in relieved murmurs. People clapped softly. A few even prayed aloud. Madison exhaled sharply, leaning back. Her heart still raced, though the danger had passed. She turned to Daniel, unable to resist. You didn't even flinch. Not once. Daniel looked at her with quiet humor. I've learned flinching doesn't help. Fear spreads fast. If I panic, he panics. He nodded toward Luke, who was now quietly dozing against his arm. Madison tilted her head. That calm? Was that the army? His jaw tightened slightly, as though considering how much to share. Finally, he said, Part of it's just life. When you've seen how fragile it can be, you don't waste time panicking. She studied him. He didn't brag, didn't posture, didn't throw his history around like a shield. He just carried it. And for the first time in her cutthroat, image-obsessed life, Madison felt almost embarrassed of herself. She whispered, I laughed at you. I thought you didn't belong here. Daniel's eyes softened, though there was no anger in them. People laugh at what they don't understand. Doesn't bother me. My son knows who I am. That's enough. But his words gnawed at her. Madison had spent decades building walls of power, mocking weakness in others before it could be used against her. Yet here was a man who didn't need armor, because his strength wasn't about wealth or power or reputation. It was about presence. The descent began. The plane shuddered slightly, but compared to earlier chaos, it felt like a calm glide. Denver's city lights sparkled beneath the clouds, a glowing promise of safety. Passengers leaned toward the windows, whispering in relief. As the wheels screeched against the runway, Madison's hand gripped the armrest. She glanced sideways and caught Daniel sliding his hand gently over Luke's, his thumb brushing away the boy's lingering tension. The sight twisted something in her chest. The plane slowed, taxied, and finally stopped. Applause erupted from the passengers. Madison almost clapped too. But instead, she sat in silence, thinking. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, everyone rushed to stand, tugging bags from overhead bins, eager to flee. Madison stayed seated, watching as Daniel helped his son first, then grabbed only a small backpack from the compartment. No designer luggage, no expensive briefcases, just one worn bag. As they shuffled toward the exit, Madison found herself walking beside him. For once, she didn't feel taller in her heels. She felt smaller. The jet bridge smelled of recycled air and disinfectant. Passengers streamed into the terminal, some hugging relatives waiting outside, others making frantic phone calls. Madison stayed close behind Daniel, unable to shake the pull. That's when a voice cut through the noise. Sergeant Hayes? Daniel turned. A man in uniform, airport security, though with a military posture that Madison immediately recognized, stepped forward. His eyes widened with recognition. I knew it was you, the man said, his tone respectful, almost reverent. We crossed paths overseas. Bravo Company, right? Afghanistan? Daniel's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, then a faint nod. Yeah. Long time ago? The officer's voice carried, drawing curious glances. This man, he said, gesturing toward Daniel, pulled 3 soldiers out of a burning convoy under heavy fire. We all thought none of them would make it. But he did it. Alone. A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Madison froze. The mocking words she had whispered earlier. First class isn't for men like him. Burned in her ears like poison. She'd called him small, ordinary. Yet strangers recognized him as extraordinary. The officer gripped Daniel's hand firmly. It's an honor to see you again, sir. Daniel nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention. I was just doing my job. But Madison could see it now. The steady voice in the turbulence, the calm in his son's fear. the quick instinct to help a stranger's baby. This wasn't a man pretending to be strong. This was a man who lived strength every day. As the officer left, Madison finally found her voice. "You're not just a single dad." Daniel turned toward her, adjusting his son's jacket. "That's all I want to be." "But she faltered. "You're more than that." He gave a small smile, maybe once. "But now, this..." He gestured to Luke, who leaned against him sleepily. "This is my mission." Her throat tightened. For years, Madison had mocked weakness, believing only dominance guaranteed survival. Yet, in that terminal, under fluorescent lights and weary faces, she realized she'd been wrong. Real power wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was a father steadying his son, a man offering kindness in chaos. She drew in a shaky breath. "I was wrong about you, Daniel." He tilted his head, regarding her with calm patience. "Then maybe," he said, "this storm wasn't wasted." Madison's lips parted, but no words came. For once, she was speechless. Daniel shifted his son higher on his shoulder and walked toward the exit. He didn't look back, but Madison did. Watching his figure fade into the crowd, she felt something strange stir inside her. A crack in the armor she'd worn all her life. Respect, humility, and maybe, just maybe, hope.